Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this, the penultimate session in our series on the Jewish contribution to the BBC. After weeks where we have explored our contribution to the arts, to drama, and to that unique period during the war where it seemed that refugees from Europe filled every conceivable post within BBC monitoring and the Foreign Service, we now turn to a very different area, that of religious programming. Last week, we learned that Britain can no longer be described as a Christian country. The Office of National Statistics' latest survey suggested that little more than 46% of the country identified itself as Christian. Other religions comes to about 11%, and although that figure is growing, it's hardly significant, which does mean that the majority of the country, nearly half of it, are of no faith at all. In the Jewish community, the statistics suggest that numbers are holding, but we know as a community that an increasing proportion of Jews, other than the Haredi, are declining in terms of identity as a faith and identify themselves more and more as a culture. When Lord Reith and his colleagues founded the BBC, it was on sound Christian principles, and the Christian vision infused the early years of broadcasting. What a different picture it is today. We have seen in our lifetimes, I think, how the specifically Christian acts of worship, of prayers, of songs of praise has broadened to include other faiths. And we have also seen, though, that the airtime for religious programming decreased steadily. So we have to ask ourselves today, what is religious broadcasting for? Is it still necessary? Is it important? And should its influence extend beyond, say, the 3 minutes a day time slot that is given to us on Radio 4? Like so much of what we have seen over the past weeks of this series, we find that Jews have punched way above their numerical weight when it comes to influence in the religious programming of the BBC. The likes of Rabbi Lionel Blue on Thought for the Day, of Rabbi Hugo Gryn on the Moral Maze, and the former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's Reith lectures have left a lasting impression on the nation. But what of the future? In this increasingly secular world, does religion have much to say? And do the wisdoms and treasures of the Jewish faith in particular still translate into something of value for the rest of Britain? So to discuss these and other issues, we have with us tonight three people who in very different ways have contributed to the BBC's religious broadcasts. We have Alex Strangwayes-Booth, a senior broadcast journalist and producer of religious programming for the BBC local radio. There's Pete Tobias, a rabbi of the Glasgow Reform Synagogue, and who was for 13 years part of the team presenting Radio 2's Pause for Thought. And Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, the rabbi of New North London Synagogue, a frequent presenter on Radio 4's Thought for the Day, and also on other religious programs. But we'll begin tonight with Alex. Alex Strangwayes-Booth is a senior journalist at the BBC. She works for BBC Local, that's all 39 local radio stations in the main, and specialises in producing stories about faith communities in England. She's been at the BBC for 26 years, starting out at BBC Radio Cleveland and Middlesbrough, now BBC Tees, before moving to BBC Sussex and Surrey in 2000, and then into her job working across the country. She's also spent time working for BBC Home Affairs and producing on the 6 and 10 o'clock news, and has produced stories for the World Service and Radio 4. During those 26 years, she's also successfully raised two children. Well, she hopes successfully. One is now at university and the other is doing A-levels. So that sounds pretty successful to me. She loves walking on the South Downs and has just done her first half marathon. She's also training to be a coach using positive psychology, all of which leaves me quite breathless. And so, Alex, over to you, please, with your thoughts on this subject.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that lovely intro, Sybil, and hello to everybody. Thank you so much for coming along this evening. It's amazing to see so many people here as well. So Sybil did a bit of an intro for me there, and indeed I have been at the BBC for 26 years, which I find quite hard to believe myself. I don't even know where that 26 years went. And I never really intended to be a radio journalist. I sort of vaguely knew I would be a journalist. My mom was a journalist. I think my mom's on this call actually as well. And I sort of always felt that calling to be a journalist. So I went to train after I left university. A couple of years after leaving university, I went to the London College of Printing and did a journalism diploma. And that was actually where I did my first little bit of religious broadcasting, because one of the features I made was about this, I decided was going to be about the assimilation of Jews into British culture. And I called that the difference between a bagel and a bun. And I have a feeling that Jonathan Romaine may have been instrumental in this piece, because Jonathan was my rabbi when I was a child. So it's always been interesting to me. The way that people play out their faith, the role that faith plays in people's lives has always been something that I'm really interested in. And also the place of Jews in British society, because, I come from a Reform Jewish background myself. My parents have different faiths. So, I always thought that was fairly normal until I realized that that wasn't the case for everybody else. So I have a great interest in the role that faith plays in our lives. So when that bagel and the bun piece, I did enjoy. I went to Brick Lane Bagel Bakery and recorded them, and I sort of shouted, "What's the difference between a bagel and a bun?" It was a great bit of radio. I enjoyed making it. I then got my first full-time job in Middlesbrough at Radio Cleveland, and I had never really been to the north of England in any significant way before. And Middlesbrough was an extraordinary place to go and live and work, because it has this strong industrial history. But at the time that I moved there, it was just at the beginning of the new Labour, really. So all the new Labour MPs were up there in our patch, in our radio patch. Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair, and it was all happening. Middlesbrough Football Club had amazing international players. It was a very strange time in the radio station's history. And somebody stopped me in a corridor. So I was producing a breakfast programme. I was a news journalist. That was very much where my calling lay. I thought I used to read the news bulletins as well. And somebody stopped me in a corridor and asked me if I would like to present the Sunday breakfast show, because they needed a presenter. I mean, they literally stopped me in a corridor. "Oh, Alex, we need someone to present Sunday breakfast. Do you want to have a go?" And it had this show was and I didn't even know the BBC did a religion thing, really beyond the songs of praise. So I realized that all the local radio stations had this 3-hour Sunday program, which was their religious affairs program, but they were entirely produced by volunteers, really across the whole country. And these people were known kind of universally as the God Squad. And they were like a strange group of people who would come in and produce stuff, and the rest of the radio station had no interaction with the Sunday breakfast show at all. It was entirely its own little siloed world. And I decided to produce it just in the same way that I would produce weekday breakfast. I didn't know that there was any other way to produce radio. So I made it quite newsy, really, because I thought faith was interesting. It was in all aspects of life. Let's go and find out what the faith groups are doing about this, whatever the issues of the day were. And actually, the Church of England did second a young clergyman to work with me. So they paid him a little bit of money, and he came and produced the show with me. And his name was Graham Usher, and he is now the Bishop of Norwich. So I said, I have been in the BBC long enough to see a curate become a bishop, in fact. And Graham and I really changed that Sunday breakfast show. And the God Squad, the team of volunteers who worked on the show, were actually very unhappy about it. And we did appear in the Northern Echo as an article about how we had really got rid of the religion. You know, they were very angry about how we were producing the show. But I really thought that we needed to professionalize Sunday Breakfast. It needed to sound the same as the rest of the radio station's output. That was something I believed and still believe very strongly. So I presented Sunday Breakfast. I was at Radio Cleveland for about 4 years. While I was in Middlesbrough Synagogue actually closed. And actually Middlesbrough had quite a big Jewish community all through its industrial past. And it had quite a big synagogue, but then there were no longer 10, they couldn't get a minyan. There was just no community left. Everyone had gone to Leeds or London or Manchester or abroad. And I went to the closing ceremony or the closing service, and there were about 300 people there from all over the world and all over the country. And I did think back to my bagel and bun story at that time, because to me that was a sign of the changing nature of the Jewish communities around the country. And actually I have just done a story this year about the decline, or the decline of the provincial Jewish communities in England. I mean, there are very few big communities left outside London and Manchester, and I mean even Leeds is smaller than it was. So you know, that is something that I have seen over my 26 years working at the BBC. And then I got a job in Brighton. I decided enough of Middlesbrough. Now, my husband and I have moved to Brighton. A lot of us left Middlesbrough. My husband's an artist. A lot of our friends were artists and musicians. They were finding it very difficult to get work in the Northeast and to get funding for their projects. And we all upped sticks and moved to Brighton. And I was lucky enough to get a job producing the Brighton and Sussex breakfast shows on radio. It was then Southern Counties Radio, it was back in 2000, and now BBC Sussex and BBC Surrey. And it was great fun. And it was a really, really enormously fun programme to work on, because it was a show for one city. I just produced the show that was just for Brighton. And I mean, that was such a joy, because it was such a quirky city. Well, we weren't a city then, we became a city. So it was great fun. I got married, I got pregnant, I had my first baby. Everything changed massively. I'm sure with the same as other industries, it's quite difficult to be a working mother in the media. It's very shift orientated. So you have to get up at 4 a.m. to go and produce breakfast shows, or work really late in the evening, or work weekends. And actually, at that point, the BBC, when Greg Dyke was the Director General at that point, and we all really loved Greg Dyke, us, the staff at the BBC, and he helped BBC Local Radio create a role which they call communities journalist, communities senior journalist. And the job of the communities journalist was to get hard to reach voices on the air. That was our job. And also to try and diversify the workforce of the BBC. So this was 2002 or something. The BBC recognised it had this issue, and the communities job was a really, really lovely job as well. And I actually got my HGV licence at that point, which I should put in my bio. I learnt to drive the BBC bus, because we had this massive bus that we could drive around and do. It had like loads of computers in it and a radio studio. And the idea was we would go out into different communities and teach people computing skills and find their stories. It was a really great idea. And we did, we had lots of funding from things like the Arts Council. So we did lovely projects with the Chinese communities and the Black and African Caribbean communities. We did a lovely project called Roots with the Arts Council, which was fabulous and really good fun as well. We did stand-up comedy workshops and storytelling workshops. It was a very, very creative time. And I think Greg Dyke kind of encouraged that kind of creativity in the BBC. And then literally overnight, they just got rid of the communities journalists. The role was just disassembled, no longer existed. Funding cuts, the bus was taken away. It was such a strange time. And that was when the BBC had a big wobble with a competition scandal. Remember, we had like a big scandal with competitions and competitions being fixed. BBC had a massive wobble. And then, of course, we had the dossier, the Sextop dossier. I mean, the BBC had a really difficult time at that point when Greg Dyke was Director General. And it wobbled all the way down to local radio. And it was at that point that I then got this job working for all the BBC local radio stations, helping to produce content centrally for their Sunday breakfast shows. And at that point, my former editor, who's called Ashley Peatfield, had been given this job as editor of religion for BBC local radio. And he was a man of great ideas and great vision. And I always said that he was like Jean-Luc Picard on the Starship Enterprise, and I was like Commander Riker, his first officer, and he would say, Alex, I want to do a story about how we're running out of burial space. I want to do a story about it. And he would say, make it so, and I would go away and make that story happen. And we did that absolutely loads through the kind of 8 years that we worked together. And our mission was to make sure that our religious affairs stories punched above their weight outside of local radio and made it onto network news as well. So that was our mission. Every year we would do 3 or 4 stories that would go out on local radio, so they would have local interest, but they would also go out on TV, network TV and radio. So I got loads of fantastic experience working with Robert Piggott, who was then the religion correspondent. I produced Caroline Wyatt for 2 days a week when she was a religion correspondent, an amazing woman, so inspirational, wonderful to work with. And then I didn't do any work with Martin Bashir when he was religion editor at all. But during that time, I also went to work on, I worked with Home Affairs for a few months, doing crime and terror. That's what they do in Home Affairs, and social affairs as well. So it was amazing to work with all these. I will say that those journalists who work at that level in the BBC are just at the top of their game. They are amazing journalists to work with. And they really pushed me out of my comfort zone and helped me do better journalism and tell better stories. And the women who work in the field, they're the top BBC women, are an amazing group as well, of supportive and mentoring women as well. And it was a pleasure to work with them. And working on the 6 and the 10 was the maddest thing I've ever done. There were moments where you produce a story for the 6 or the 10 o'clock news. So you're working with a correspondent or a reporter, and it's absolutely mental. And then when your story goes out on air, you have to go into the gallery and stand next to the director while your story goes out. And I was like, why do you have to do that? Is there like, there's a trapdoor that's going to open if it goes wrong, and you're just like dropped into the bowels of your broadcasting house, never to be seen again. Most terrifying thing I've ever done. So it was very high octane working in that newsroom, actually. Really amazing experience. I'm so glad I did it. And then what happened then? Well, COVID happened, didn't it? Yeah, COVID happened. And actually, it was a very strange time to be working for the 39 local radio stations, because we decided in the first weekend of lockdown, we would make a half-hour Sunday worship program. And local radio had never really done this before. So Radio 4 does an act of worship in the mornings on Sunday. And it's a bit like when they asked me to, in the corridor, to present Sunday breakfast. It's like, I don't know how to make a worship program, so I'm just going to make it like a really good radio program that anybody will enjoy listening to. So we did these half-hour acts of worship. The first one was with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it was quite formal. And then we just carried on doing them. And I did it with, I got a football team who are all loads of Christians on this Wycombe Wanderers football team, loads of Christians, got them to do the Sunday service. I don't know, I'm sort of top of my head, I can't think of the other ones, but they were really popular half-hour of radio on BBC local radio. And the thing about local radio is that there are about 6 or 7 million people listen to local radio every week. So it's actually, when you add it all together as a network, it's the third biggest network on the BBC after Radio 4 and Radio 2. So, and it reaches 2 million people who listen to local radio, never consume any other BBC content. That's all they're listening to, is local radio. So, you know, my argument is always like, with a huge amount of focus on Thought for the Day when it comes to religious broadcasting, our audience don't listen to Thought for the Day. They're not coming across it. You know, they're not listening to the Radio 4 offering at all, in fact. So, you know, that's always really interesting to me, and I keep it very much in mind when I produce my programming. It's also the only, I mean, it's C2DE, they call it. It's effectively the only working class audience the BBC has, is listening to local radio and watching EastEnders. So it's a very particular audience. They loved the Sunday service. It was very popular. But we also did 10-minute reflections with the Sikh, Hindu and Muslim communities. So we couldn't quite do an act of worship in the same way. And that is always something the BBC is not quite sure about doing. Well, but it will probably have to start thinking about it now. And we also did these wonderful, I like them better than the 10-minute reflections. We did short drop-ins, which I called Keeping Faith. And they were 2 minutes of somebody from, they were Sikh, Muslim, Hindu and Jewish, talking about how their faith had helped them during the pandemic. So they started out just being somebody just saying, this is how my faith helps me. I get up in the morning and pray. I go out and help in my community. It was all, every story was different. They were just little gems of radio. They were lovely. And we did those pretty much all until early this year. And then we stopped doing those bits of broadcasting. We only do the Sunday service now on big, like I'm doing one for Christmas Day. You know, we did one for the Queen's funeral. You know, so when something big happens, they say, Alex, go and make a Sunday service. Commander Riker, go and make a Sunday service. I do. So I think what I asked for, when that happened, my editor, Ashley, who had been this great support to me all these years, took redundancy. And I was really left, you know, as a sort of lone person doing religion stuff for local radio. And I asked if I could keep the producers who were making the long reflections, I asked if I could keep them on and get them to make stories about their different communities for the local radio stations instead. So we have this great team of producers, and we meet every Monday, and we always laugh because it's like there's a Sikh and a Muslim and a Hindu and a Jew, and they talk about the stories they're going to make that week, and then off we go and do them. So, you know, I think that's something really special, and I really want to see that kind of making more impact on the BBC, the work that we're doing in that area. So what's happened, and I'll stop talking. So the last stage of this story is that I don't know if any of you saw the news that BBC local radio is absolutely changing. So it has basically had a bomb dropped on it. And the reason is, you know, we're going to lose all our listeners at some point. We're not replenishing our listeners effectively because people just aren't consuming radio in the same way that they used to. And BBC Local does not have a space online. Where do you go for the public service online? There is no space for it. So the vision of the people at the top of local radio is not to cut local radio so much as reinvent it so that it tells its stories in the digital space first. And the radio continues, but the resources are all going into digital storytelling. So what's happening with the Sunday shows is that they are being reduced from 39 shows down to 10. regional shows. So what were 39 local shows are becoming 10 regional shows. And I'm told that I'm staying on to produce the central content that I already produce, because I produce about 5 or 6 stories a week, which sort of shore up, that's not quite the right way of describing it, but it helps the shows which are very badly resourced on their local station. So they've always got really strong content that I produce for them. And then they go out and find some other local stories that they can tell really well. But that will change because, you know, a regional show is not a local show. So for local faith groups, that means that it's going to be harder to get their stories onto their local radio station than it was before. And, you know, anybody who is interested in getting their stories told on the radio needs to start thinking very differently about how to get their stories told, because everything we do will be led by the strength of a story, not by somebody putting on an event or it being Refugee Week or even Mitzvah Day. It will be, well, what's the story behind all of that? So that's really where they go, 26 years in a nutshell. And I guess part of the reason I'm still there is because I've never been bored, really. I've often been frustrated. I have sometimes been depressed. I have sometimes been very angry, but I have never been bored. And it keeps changing. And I keep remaining and staying engaged. So let's see what happens. Oh, Sybil, you're on mute.
Right, I'm very sorry. Yes. That's absolutely fascinating. I would like to explore more what you mean by stories. I mean, when you say that the Jewish community and other communities have to stop being event driven, because I know mentally I've always thought when sort of pitching for slots in radio or in newspapers, thinking what's the thing that what's the peg, and it has to be an event, otherwise it's irrelevant. If it's not news, it's irrelevant. So what do you mean by story in this context?
I mean, events aren't irrelevant as such, but I am really encouraging our producers to stop doing events, because I think that it takes your effort away from, what's a good story? I mean, I'm making a program for Christmas now, and called Keeping Faith at Christmas, which is an hour-long program that's going out on Christmas Day on all the stations. And in that program, I've got a story about some Ukrainians who are celebrating their first Christmas here. I mean, their stories are amazing, because they're still in the difficulty of having moved here. It's not even a year yet. So it's a single father and a single mother. Both have other families still in Ukraine. Just talking about the last year and what it's been like, and just them talking about it is really engaging, although it's edited together cleverly with music and sound effects. But it's so that they are the people at the heart of the story. So that's the kind of thing. So if there is a broad story, then that's the broad story. But then who are the people who can bring that story to life, really? And having those people who are willing to come on the radio and talk about it as well. So I did this was a day which was the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the most clumsy title of any campaign ever in the whole world. But I worked with the Mothers Union, who found me an amazing woman who was willing to talk about her story, very powerful. That her story was enough. I said to them, it doesn't even need to be the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, because her story is so strong. I could have told it any time. It didn't matter. So I think people who are willing to tell their difficult stories. I think we love a journey. We love somebody we love the hero's journey. We love, it was good, it was bad, I overcame it, now it's good. I mean, everybody loves that. But we only tell one story, really, don't we?
I was interested, I mean, it seems that during COVID, a lot of people sort of turned to faith who, hadn't necessarily before. I mean, I'm assuming that that's why you responded by producing religious services online and upping the sort of religious input. But at the same time, I know when we talked earlier, you said that people are quite scared of religion. Can you say why, and how can we counter that?
When we were talking, did I say it was the producers of the BBC who are scared of religion?
No, you didn't. You just said people are quite scared of religion. I was like,
that's awkward. Like, we don't talk about religion or money, at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Thing. So, most people don't know people of lots of different faiths. So, the household that I grew up in was actually very, 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 very unusual. And I know so many people of different faiths, I almost take it for granted that I know loads of people of different faiths. So I have to be occasionally reminded that most people don't know somebody of a different faith to them and wouldn't really know how to even start a conversation with somebody of a different faith. So I sort of see my job as providing that on the radio, so that when you turn on the radio, you meet someone of a different faith and they're talking about heating their house during the winter, or running the food bank, or domestic violence, or looking after a Ukrainian, or that's how I perceive my job. So that's outside the BBC. I think we need to introduce people to people of different faiths, because I think one of the best things about Britain is the multi-faith culture that we have. It's almost unique. I mean, really, I don't think we even realise how unusual it is in the world in this day and age to have a country where we have so many faiths all living together and talking to each other. It's very special, and we need to protect it. And I think with it, but then on the other side, within the BBC, Ofcom did an interesting bit of research that found that the BBC was disproportionately secular compared to the rest of the country. So, and Channel 4 and ITV, all the broadcasters were. It's a secular, the staff are disproportionately secular. And I would say that informs my experience at the BBC, that people they're suspicious. They think religion is probably a bad thing, and people do bad stuff in religions. We'll tell the story if they're doing bad stuff in religions. They love it when religions go rogue or go wrong. And also there's a level of religious illiteracy, even among the BBC staff. They don't really know what other faiths believe. They don't know how they worship. They don't know the different denominations within the different faiths, and they don't really care.
Right. So do you have a sort of personal mission to change that, to bring, to bring more religious programming into the BBC? Would you like to do that?
No, I don't. I kind of don't want it to be my personal mission, actually. I would like the BBC more widely. I would like for religious stories not to belong in a siloed slot. And I do think that the BBC is trying to do that. So they do have a religion steering committee. It's all going right when there's a steering committee. And which is really good, because it gets everybody who's doing religious stories together a few times a year to talk about what they're doing. And there is an attempt to kind of make engaging stories about different faith groups, but they do tend to veer a little bit towards celebrities going on a pilgrimage, type programming. But I don't think it's my personal mission. I can't change the BBC. I know this. If I know one thing after 26 years, it's I can't change the BBC. But what I can do, and what I can impact, is the stories that I tell on the BBC.
Thank you very much. I think that's great. Thank you. We'll come back to you later, but I'd like now to introduce Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg. He was appointed the rabbi of the new North London Masorti Synagogue in 1987 and senior rabbi of the Assembly of Masorti Synagogues UK in 2008. He's president of the Council of Christians and Jews and a co-founder of Eco-Judaism and closely involved in supporting refugees. He teaches and speaks widely, including Radio 4's Thought for the Day and Prayer for the Day. And his publications include The Eternal Journey, Meditations on the Jewish Year, The Silence of Dark Water, An Inner Journey, Walking with the Light, My Dear Ones, One Family and the Final Solution, and Things My Dog Has Taught Me About Being a Better Human. He's married to Nicola Solomon and they have 3 children. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll begin with the way a couple of those books got me onto the BBC, and it's basically Radio 4. But here beside me is my current dog, but it was with my previous dog that I'd walked from Frankfurt back to London. I won't go into why. So I was invited by actually Claire Balding to interview me, and with the dog. But when I got outside the BBC buildings, there was a problem. They said, we'll have to do a security check before we can allow your dog in. So I kind of, what's the security check? Said the dog might lift up its leg and wee on an electric power point and short circuit all the fuses in the BBC's building. So mercifully, the dog did nothing of the kind and actually finished up sitting on Claire Balding's lap during most of the interview. But that was one of my first experiences at the BBC. And I want to say that I've always found, with particularly Prayer for the Day and Thought for the Day, which have been my main involvement, I found the BBC extremely helpful, extremely thoughtful, and that the editing has been very professional and very careful and very disciplined. And I've valued that very greatly. I was approached both by Prayer for the Day, first of all, and then by Thought for the Day. They are very, very different. With Prayer for the Day, first of all, it's strictly for insomniacs or BBC iPlayer players, because I think it comes with a farming program at about something to 6 in the morning. And I have to admit, I've very rarely listened to it live myself. But you're given several months notice. And a period of, you do a whole week, that's except for Sundays, you do 6 days in a row. And quite often it's pitched so that I have Hanukkah or I have holidays or Holocaust Memorial Day. It's very short and it's reflective. And you submit your scripts and they ask you to end with a prayer. And it was very interesting when Alex listening to you saying, difficult with other faiths to do an act of worship because we don't necessarily treat prayer in quite the same way. So a kind of one-liner concluding Amen, I found quite difficult and couldn't always comply. I couldn't always do that. Thought for the Day is really very different. Because it's given this sort of time slot in the middle of a fast-moving news program. Now, until just the first one I did in person, actually being in the studio, was just about 2-3 weeks ago. But I'd been grateful for COVID that one could pre-record, because if I mess up and swallow a word, I had this chance to do it again. Whereas live on the air, you don't get that. But when you go into the studio and you see people, and I really admire this, they're being handed sheets of new news all the time. They have to keep this program going with good humor. I leave there admiring their skills terrifically. I have no idea how they do it. But Thought for the Day is extremely carefully edited. One of the things which terrifies me is that they really want you to write it the day before you do it. They want you to relate to what's happening in the news and in the world now. For myself, that's a real problem because I like to sleep on things and mull them over the night before. So I usually speak to my producer in the afternoon before the day before. But one of the challenging things is I see it very much as an opportunity to express values and to express them in traditional Jewish terms. I'm very mindful of representing the Jewish community, and not a lot, but usually afterwards I get a few tweets either from fellow Jews or slightly anti-Semitic. So I, very conscious of representing Judaism in the public square in quite a well listened to place. And one of the challenges is, as the BBC, as the producers put it, it's an unchallenged, almost 3-minute slot in prime time, and therefore you can't be, in inverted commas, political. And yet Judaism is political through and through. The Bible is a political book. It talks about politics. It comes from the Greek polis, meaning in the city. So Judaism is very much about how we behave in society, what the ethics and morals of society are. And I remember a couple of quite challenging things. I mean, sometimes it's a festival and it's not challenging. I want to talk about that festival. But I had thought for the day just after there'd been this comment, at the time unattributed, let the bodies pile up, but no more lockdowns. So I took that comment and said, it's not the kind of language we want in public discourse. Think of the people who've suffered and what it means to them. I did not, in fact, I think it was later confirmed that it was attributed to the Prime Minister. I didn't mention that. I didn't know who said it. I didn't pretend to know, and in a way I didn't care. But the Daily Mail picked it up and said, thought for the day is getting too political. Kind of the BBC should get back in its box. And the great thing about the article, they put a picture of me in there and they said, these people on Thought for the Day should go back to the Gospels, which I thought was great advice to give a rabbi. More recently, I had just a couple of days after Joe versus Wade was overturned by the American Supreme Court. And in a way, perhaps I was lucky that I had a bit of an outsider faith perspective, but it was 7 or 8 hours of negotiation, very friendly negotiation, but negotiation between, first of all, my script editor, and then it goes to a second editor to make sure that it was considered adequately balanced. And that's quite challenging when actually, I think like many people, I felt very angry about that decision. I felt it was a very dangerous decision. I felt it set very dangerous precedents. But how do you kind of say that in inverted commas without being political? And then I seem to be drawing some short straws at the moment. I had the morning before the budget just now, and actually that script got through unamended. But I really wanted to talk about, I'd been with the Trussell Trust and they'd been talking about something deeper than politics on which we could agree as a country that there should be minimums for how children should be enabled to live in this society. So that's been quite, it's a privilege, it's challenging, and it is a bit nerve-wracking. And the one thing they don't want you with Thought for the Day to do is to prepare much beforehand, because it should be a response to the now. What else have I had on the BBC? One or two, one very Jewish moment, and then I'll stop, which was, I was asked on the Sunday program, and I was asked to talk about my new book, my dear ones, One Family and the Final Solution, which is my father's family story during the Holocaust. And it would appear that the editor had never been told that this was why I was asked in. So I sat there waiting to talk about my book when the editor said to me, is Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite? And I had so not expected that. And this was before most of the things about Jeremy Corbyn's leadership came out. And kind of you almost don't know what I'm going to say next. But I said, he hasn't done enough to prove that he isn't. And luckily that turned out to be an adequate response. But that reminded me that kind of live on air, one can be thrown very suddenly at any moment. And that I'm conscious of representing the Jewish community and wanting to do so in a good light. I think I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm fascinated. I really do want to ask you the original question I asked at the beginning. What is religious broadcasting for? I mean, the original sort of Reithian ideal was, broadcasting was to inform, educate, and entertain. I'm never quite sure where religious broadcasting comes into that. Is it for information or education or entertainment? I mean, why are we doing it?
that is a challenging question. I remember one time on Thought for the Day, I can hear Hugo Grinn's voice in my mind, more than Lionel Blues as well, but Hugo Grinn, they were both my teachers at rabbinical school at Leobeck College. And this particular producer said, I want more theology in your script and less story. And I don't naturally think like that. I think stories, Alex said that very, very clearly, stories are very listenable to. And I think any kind of educate piece in those sort of short slots comes through story much more than it comes through sort of straight theology and quote from the Bible or whatever source one uses. So I think the listenable to human voice can then lead to some sense of communication of some of the values and the depths of life and human experience. And I think that's what it's for.
And do you think that religious broadcasting can actually sort of enhance the spiritual life of people in Britain?
I can think of moments where I'm a Radio 4 when I'm driving kind of listener, and then late at night television, basically anything about the world of nature to calm the mind after a long day. But I can think of things I've picked up as I've been driving along, which have really, really touched me and moved me. They almost invariably do come from people's stories, but they're about the spiritual and moral depths, the resilience of human nature, sometimes incidents, occasionally humor. I remember once I had to turn off the motorway because something made me laugh so much I wasn't safe to drive. But much more, it's these stories that really touch and move. And yes, I think can make a difference. I couldn't quantify that difference, but does make a difference. In a very material-centered world, it's an opportunity to say something different.
And the other question, clearly you have this sense that, you are representing Judaism online. Now that we are reaching out to so many different faiths, one question I have is, aren't they ultimately all saying the same thing?
Possibly. I don't find that a problem, because I very much believe there's one God. We find different sort of paths up that mountain. So I'm interested both in the difference and in the togetherness. Maybe they are, but they're saying it from different contexts, in different kind of people's lives and different narratives, and awareness of those different narratives is really important. It's interesting, Alex said again, bringing people together, not just on radio, but off radio, across this very rich society is really important. And when the 7th of July happened, the London bombings, my wife picked up a comment on the radio, you just think of a Muslim family you know. And her comment was, how many people know Muslim families? And so I think that the coming together is really important. I also think, and again, Alex, something you said, that there's a tendency to silo religion. I felt that very strongly when I was at COP26 in Glasgow. The religious leaders have one space. Actually, I don't want to talk to other religious leaders in that context. I want to talk to the politicians and the business leaders. And I think the cross-fertilization of different kinds of discourse in our society is really important. And perhaps more could be done about that on air by the BBC and other broadcasters.
So in a sense, you have a sort of responsibility, or to speak truth to power in a way that you have that opportunity through those programs.
Yes.
Can you just tell me briefly, because I know most of what you've done has been Radio 4. You've done some television as well?
Very little bits of television. A little bit, but really very, very, very little.
Is it very different? I get the sense that we are largely, we are talking today exclusively about radio, but I'd be interested to know what, is television different in the way it approaches this?
I haven't had enough experience to judge, and some of it has been sort of like the last television thing I did was actually when I was interviewed as I was chaplain to the queue to pay tribute to the Queen. So some of it has been almost coincidental that it's come about. I don't have the experience to make that to comment on that.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Again, we'll come back to you later because I'd be interested to hear maybe later a little bit more about, how your campaigns for, with ecology, how that translates into your radio broadcasting. But having now looked at two of the most populous BBC areas, local radio and Radio 4, we must go to the third one, which is Radio 2, and Rabbi Pete Tobias. Pete was ordained as a progressive rabbi in 1990. He has served in 3 congregations in the UK, Birmingham Progressive Synagogue, Glasgow Reform Synagogue, and the Liberal Synagogue in Elstree, and now has returned to Glasgow for a second stint there. His publications include Liberal Judaism, a Judaism for the 21st century, and Never Mind the Bullocks, and Putting the O in God. His broadcasting career began in Birmingham in the early 1990s when he appeared on BBC West Midlands Sunday morning programme, which I think Alex must have been involved in. And it took off during his first stint in Scotland, where he was presenter of Thought for the Day on Good Morning Scotland. Then he moved south in 2003 and was headhunted for Radio 2's breakfast show and was a regular on its Pause for Thought slot with the late Sir Terry Wogan and Chris Evans from 2004 to 2015. He also featured on Radio 2's Good Morning Sunday with Aled Jones, Claire Balding and other presenters. And his return to Glasgow has seen him once again giving thought for the day to listeners to BBC Scotland's Morning Breakfast. Pete is a faithful supporter of Watford Football Club and has a son and 2 grandchildren in California and lives in Glasgow with his partner. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Sybil. What a fine introduction. Nothing ever like that on any radio show. So, yes, as you mentioned, Radio 2 was a kind of a focal point for me, but I want to go back a wee bit further than that and start with how my radio career really began. It started off, as you mentioned, in Birmingham, but that was just doing odd bits on the Sunday morning show. But when I arrived in Glasgow in 1995, I'd only been here a couple of weeks, and there was a broadcast on Radio Scotland entitled "The Jews of Glasgow," and it was all various rabbis were interviewed and other members of communities, and they were interviewing the rabbi of Garnet Hill Synagogue. So just quick bit of geography. Garnet Hill is in the west end of Glasgow, but most of the Jews now live on the south side of the city, which is where all the synagogues are. And he was being interviewed, and he said, well, our members live on the south side, but they drive to the synagogue in the west end, so they bend the rules a bit. On the south side, there's a Reform Synagogue. Now, they really bend the rules, but we bend the rules just a bit. And that was the only mention of the Reform Synagogue in an hour-long programme about Glasgow's Jewish community. So I wrote a little letter of protest about this to the Beeb, got invited to take part in another radio broadcast soon after that, and they decided for whatever reason that they would wheel me in to do their Thought for the Day slot on their Good Morning Scotland programme. And it kind of took off from there. So by the time I left here after 8 years in Glasgow, I'd had a couple of 30-minute broadcasts all about me, and I was doing Thought for the Day on a regular basis, and it was quite a nice little bit of celebrity that I was quite happy with. And then I moved down south, and it all stopped. And I mean, there are a couple of anecdotes. I'll keep an eye on the time because I could tell you anecdotes for some time to come if I put my mind to it. I'll try not to. But anyway, I'd been there. I was at a meeting of a group of rabbis with which you might be familiar, where we used to get together once every 3 months and discuss how terrible life in the rabbinate was and how could things be better. And I said, sorry, I'm reaching around for my mains lead here because I'm seeing my battery might run out imminently, which would not be a good, or maybe it will be a good thing. I don't know. Perhaps that would be a way to stop me. Sorry about that. See, this is why it works on radio. None of that would have been a problem if I had the camera in front of me. I could carry on fiddling around with that and nobody would have been any the wiser. But there you go. Right, we are now on, we have power. So all is well. So I was at this meeting of rabbis and I was complaining about the fact that I'd been down in England for about 6 months, having left Scotland, and I wasn't doing any radio. And I was very upset that Radio 2 hadn't contacted me. And a colleague of mine who said, well, he said, that's impatience bordering on insanity. to be expecting something like that to happen so quickly. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Terry Wogan's producer, and ended up being invited to do the Pause for Thought slot on BBC Radio 2 on the breakfast show. And the director of Liberal Judaism at the time said to me, "Why Radio 2? Why not Radio 4?" To which I replied, "Well, twice as many people listen to Radio 2, so that's good enough for me." So that was why I enjoyed that place on Radio 2. And the way that it worked in the early days, in the Terry Wogan, the Chris Evans days too, you'd get given a day a week, maybe a Tuesday or a Thursday, and then you would have 4 Tuesdays or Thursdays in a row, or 6, or in one case, for reasons that I can't remember why, back in Terry Wogan days, where people were disappearing left, right, and centre, I did 11 in a row one time, which was unheard of and probably shouldn't have been allowed, but anyway, it was. So that was how it worked on Radio 2. And one of the joys of Radio 2, which I think is very different from the experience that Jonathan was talking about on the Thought for the Day on Radio 4, and that's no less true in Thought for the Day up here in Scotland as well, is that just as important as the thought that you are giving is the kind of banter that you can build in either side of the thought of the script. So that you're not just, they don't just say, "Now it's over to whoever for the pause for thought," and you just read your script. You have to engage in a little exchange with Terry Wogan and then subsequently with Chris Evans. And the challenge that was always to see how you could introduce your script as seamlessly as possible. That was always the challenge. Could you just ease your way into your script without saying, "Now let me get on with my pause," or worse still, having Terry Wogan or Chris Evans say, "Now what have you got for us today?" Because if they said that, then you knew you'd messed up and you were just talking too much rubbish and needed to get on with your script. So I've got a few little pieces here just to share with you from that particular experience. So here we are in the Terry Wogan days, and there is Sir Terry, the late Sir Terry himself, and me sitting opposite. And one of the things that was always a true in the in Terry Wogan studios, that there was always food. Okay, they always used to eat, and one of my specialties was either taking in bagels, or in this particular case it was about Hanukkah, and so it went a bit like this.
Now then, I'm very pleased to say that the Rabbi Pete Tobias from the Liberal Synagogue in Elstree is with us, and I'm doubly pleased because he brought with him some latkes. And very nourishing they are. And light as feathers.
Light as feathers.
Your own cooking?
My own cooking, homemade by my own hand, is this very morning in a kitchen not a million miles from here, and brought all the way up to town and got cold on the way. Sorry about that. But
never mind. I can eat them. I can eat anything.
I noticed that. I think the listeners should know, actually, the speed with which various bits of food have come into the studio and disappeared during the course of this morning. I think it's worth people out there knowing what goes on.
It is murder, isn't it? I don't know how we've time to broadcast. Why the latkes, then?
Well, latkes, it's because it's the festival of Hanukkah begins this evening, and latkes and donuts and other extremely unhealthy foods are associated with that particular festival.
So that was that. And on that particular occasion, I don't know if you recognize this once famous chef, but on that particular morning, Heston Blumenthal was also in the studio. And this is a picture of Heston Blumenthal eating one of my latkes and describing it as being very light. So there you go. That was a little bit of kudos for me there, having my latke eaten by this gentleman. And then food in the studio, as I say, was quite a big deal. And here is an example of that. This is the full spread here of there's a loaf of challah, there's chopped herring, there's all sorts there for Chris Evans back in his day when he took over from Terry Wogan. And the bagel got me probably one of my favourite gigs of all, which was when I gave a bagel to Sarah Cox, who is still a DJ at the on Radio 2. And it's the only time I gave her a bagel in the morning. And later that afternoon, she sent me a message on Twitter asking me to marry her, which I thought was quite an achievement. That was pretty good going for a bagel, but only to conduct her wedding, not actually to marry her personally. But I thought that was pretty good going. So she married a Jewish husband, who, when they are still married, they became members of my synagogue. And so that was one of my favorite lines. Moving on, I briefly mentioned TV. I know Sybil mentioned TV. I didn't get much TV work. I was always told I had the perfect looks for radio, and that seems to have carried me safely through my career. But I got an email once from the researcher for Silent Witness, And she said, I hope you don't mind us getting in touch. We're looking for some advice about a shiva. We've got an Israeli character who loses his family, and we would like some advice as to how to conduct a shiva. Well, I'm very sorry, she said, we can't give you a credit and we can't pay you. And to which I replied, well, I don't want a credit or I don't want payment. A small walk-on part will do just fine. To which she replied, well, we might be able to manage that. And here is my small walk-on part in an episode of Silent Witness. But more interestingly, I think, than my small walk-on part was, I don't know how well you can see it, in the middle is this rather ugly little chair, which of course is a shiva chair that came all the way from my synagogue in Elstree to some house in London that had been rented for the occasion. And the shiva chair, although I was only on screen for about 2 minutes, the shiva chair featured for about a quarter of an hour. So the day after that program was broadcast, here is the shiva chair in the synagogue on the Saturday morning, as seen on BBC's Silent Witness. And I think it's got its own agent now doing its own bookings for it. Is there any more? Yes, just one last thing. This sounds a bit egotistical, which of course it probably is. But this is one of my favourite tweets. So as somebody from Watford Football Club was listing all the names of all the celebrities, using the term loosely, he said, fans of Watford Football Club. So there was Elton, all these various other people, I don't know who they are, Brian Connolly, Kenzie, and then Anthony Joshua, boxer, Steve Finn, cricketer, and Pete Tobias, rabbi. I thought that was pretty good going. So I was quite pleased with that as an accolade for being a Watford fan. Right, that's the end of that. I'm going to stop the share now and come back to something a little more serious. So I was on Radio 2 for that remarkable length of time, and by all accounts, 11 years as a pause for thought presenter was something that everybody seemed to sort of have about a 2-year lifespan, and that was about it. And there were a couple of moments that I just want to share with you, just to show that you can sometimes be put in some pretty precarious positions. I mean, Jonathan intimated that there were some of those when a presenter can sort of throw you a curveball and you're not quite sure where to go with it. There was one time when I was on, it was Johnny Walker, actually, who may be known to some of you, who was sitting in for Terry Wogan around Christmas time, when Terry always took time off. And I talked about the fact that it was Hanukkah, and the fact that it coincided that particular year was quite close to Christmas, and the different messages, or rather the same messages actually, that they really, that all the materialistic stuff and the going out and buying things and all the rest of it was really not what any of these festivals were about. They were about messages of spirituality and faith. And then at the end of that thought, Johnny Walker comes back and says, so why don't your lot believe in Jesus then? Which is not the easiest of questions to have to answer on one leg, so to speak. So I just said, well, there are different ways to reaching God, and left it at that, and then gave him a look and said, what the hell were you doing saying that to me for? Chris Evans did something similar a few years later when I was talking about what was happening in Libya. And I can't remember exactly what the thought was about, but it was about we should talk to each other rather than shoot at each other, was the general message that I was trying to put across. And Chris Evans says to me, again, live on air, so do you think he's nuts then, talking about Colonel Gaddafi? And again, I thought, well, I can't say yes on air. I can't really say anything. So I just said, oh, well, I couldn't possibly say, nodding my head vigorously at the time, which of course is one of the benefits of radio as well. One of the, I think Alex mentioned certain changes that were enforced on the BBC because of things that went wrong. And there was a particularly unpleasant event. I think Alex will probably remember better than me, but it was around, I think about 2012-ish, where it was Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand doing a show, and they were particularly unpleasant and really unpleasant about Andrew Sachs. And the level of complaint that followed from that particular exchange live on radio led to a whole new level of compliance that was brought in, where scripts had to be checked and then double checked and everything else looked over. And it became quite an arduous task to get any script past a producer, the hoops one had to jump through to have a script accepted. And that Libya script that I just mentioned when I was talking about what was happening with Gaddafi and so on, was one such example where I made reference to the sound of murderous bullets, I think was the phrase, something like that. And the producer said, well, I'm not sure you can say murderous about bullets. I said, what would you like me to say? Fluffy. So in the end, I was allowed to say murderous. So that was allowed. But there were times, and a little light-hearted one as well, which I think, which is, I'll say that one till the end. But there were a couple of other occasions, and Jonathan mentioned them as well, where you get nothing like, he was worried about having to do it the day before. There were a couple of times when I was put in the position of having to write a script half an hour before reading it. And that meant the compliance rules went out the window. Everybody had to take me on trust that I would actually not say anything inappropriate, because they didn't know whether they had to trust me. There was something that happened. If something happens one particular morning or overnight, you've written your script the previous day, you've had it approved, and then you suddenly get a text message in the morning on your way into the studio in London, say, any chance you could do something on this instead? So there were a couple of occasions when I've been sitting in the car outside the studio with my phone rewriting a script that I'm then go on air to deliver without anybody having the chance to check it through. But perhaps a couple of wee anecdotes to finish with, and then obviously, Sybil, I know you've got some questions, and hopefully everybody else has too. But there was one time when I'd just come down from Scotland. I moved out from Scotland to London, and I hadn't made it into the Radio 2 studios at that stage, but I got a call from Scotland saying, would you like to do a pause for thought for April the 1st? We just think, we know you've got a bit of humour, so we'd like to invite you to go into your local studio, which was in Luton, and do this script for April the 1st. So I had this script worked out. It wasn't very funny, but they said it was okay. And I got into the studio at 7:15 for the Radio Scotland slot, and about 7 o'clock. And the pause for thought was usually at about 7:20. And when I got up to the studio desk, they said, "Oh, you Pete Tobias? We've had a call from your producer in Glasgow. They'd like you to change your thought." I'm thinking, yeah, right, April the 1st. That's funny at 7:10. So I phoned the guys and no, we really do want you to change your thought. We've just heard the Pope is dying, and we don't think it's going to be very appropriate if a rabbi comes on telling a joke while the rest of the world is waiting for the Pope to die. Can you rewrite your script? This is at 7:10. So this was all pre mobile phones were very basic in those days. So I went into this studio, which was about the size of a small wardrobe, with an envelope and a pen, and rewrote my script on the back of this envelope. And I did it, and I had it written and ready, and they said, we'll delay the pause for thought until 7:20 so that we can give you time to deliver it. Got there and got to 7:25, and they were about to go live. And I sent the producer a text saying, I've just reread my script. I don't like it. I'm going to go with the original April the 1st one. And I could see him sitting there waiting to pull the plug on me. And then I sent another text saying, April Fool, and then did the one that I just rewritten. And that seems to go down okay. And it's still, when I came back here just a year or so ago and bumped into some of the producers from those days who are still around, they said, oh, we remember that. You're well known for that one in 2005 or whatever it was. But my favorite one is, as I mentioned before, a different DJ would often sit in for Terry Wogan during the Christmas period. And so I was given a series of Tuesdays or whatever it was that began with Boxing Day and ran right through into the middle of January. So I went in on Boxing Day and I'd written a script, and it was a time when Christmas coincided with Hanukkah. So my basis of my script was to say that, well, Hanukkah isn't really about a bit of oil that lasted for 8 days. It's about a group of people maintaining their faith in adversity, and the idea of the oil lasting for 8 days was just a legend that was written some years later. And then I said, but then again, the presents that you opened yesterday probably weren't delivered down your chimney by a bloke in a red suit with a white beard. This has been approved by my producer the day before, so obviously they were quite happy with it. And I did my thought and went away, didn't think anything of it. Went back the next Tuesday and gave another thought, and it was still the DJ who was sitting in for Terry Wogan. The following Tuesday, the first one of the next year, Terry Wogan was back on, and the producer met me at the door of the studio. He said, "What the hell did you say?" He'd come back to an email inbox full of complaints about this bloody rabbi who had dared to suggest that Father Christmas wasn't real on Radio 2 on Boxing Day morning, and all hell had broken loose by all accounts. But anyway, I seem to have got away with that one. But it just goes to show you can trash your own religion, but you don't dare trash anybody else's. That is some kind of a message there. So fairly light-hearted. I mean, obviously there is serious stuff in there as well. And one of the advantages of being on Radio 2, particularly, I think, well, A, because there's twice as many people listening, which is always a big deal. But actually, you do get a chance to put a serious message in it. And part of the, and it was, I spoke to the late Lionel Blue just before I went on to Radio 2. I said, how do you do this? He said, just remember that, you know, that you're speaking to people. And I think that's the key piece, is that, and it's, I was talking to a fellow Pause for Thought presenter who's an Anglican priest a couple of years back, and it stood us in good stead for dealing with COVID, for having this kind of conversation where you're just effectively talking to yourself. But it was a way of combining a bit of humor with something a bit serious that you can dress up and put into the message that you're giving. And you can do it knowing that, and even though you're not talking to an audience, that's true when you're talking to COVID, if you've got a bunch of blank screens or whatever it might be. And certainly the first online broadcasts I did during COVID were to Facebook, where there was you couldn't see who, you knew they were there, but you couldn't see anybody or even a name. But there's that sense that you are actually speaking to someone and it's having a conversation. And that, I think, is the key element of what works in radio. It's that when you're doing something like this, if you can imagine you're speaking to one person, and I've heard people say it's when you said that, it was like you were just talking to me. And if that's, I think, what radio can do, and that's what makes radio so special, and why I feel I've been very privileged to have had the opportunities that I've had to be in that position for the length of time that I was, and be in the homes of us and the ears of as many people as was the case. And thank you to the ears of the people listening this evening as well, who have also suffered me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you. I just a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. You're back at Radio Scotland after a number of years. Has it changed?
Yeah, it's got a new building, a bit like the BBC down south as well. It's also got a nice new building. Not really. I mean, in fact, the sort of the obsessive need to check every detail of the script seems a little bit less frenetic up here. Nobody seems to be quite so paranoid about saying something wrong. I don't think it has. I think that there's something, for all the technology, for all the political correctness, for all the other things that have been part of the broadcast experience of the last 25 years, I guess, since I really started doing it. But the essence is still the same. It's one person talking to a bunch of people that they can't see, and you have to.
And the message remains the same.
Yeah, absolutely, and as urgently needed to be heard as was the case 25 years ago, if not more so.
Does that sort of argue for the fact that your words are falling on deaf ears?
No, they're just falling on different ears now. I think that's the point. Right. And the thing is that I used to get, I've got a little collection of emails and texts that people have sent on the back of scripts, just to, whenever you feel that, there is a sense of that. I think in anybody looking at the world today, if you've spent 30 years of your life trying to, in a job where the purpose is to try and make the world better, and the world seems not to want to hear your message, it's nice to have an occasional reminder that actually you did reach somebody and somebody appreciated it. And it does I think it does make a difference, not on a global sense, but on a kind of an individual, personal level to those who happen to be listening. And I think that's good enough. I think that's good enough.
So you would say that in spite of the fact that the world, or certainly the UK, seems to be becoming increasingly secular, the messages that come through and Pause for Thought or Thought for the Day on Radio 4 are still vitally needed by people.
All the more so, I think, precisely for that reason, because because there's so much materialism, I think, is the real thing. And I think that one of the roles that religion has, and one of its most important messages, if you like, is to remind people that it isn't just about what you own or what you earn. It's about who you are and how you treat other people. And that's the end of today's Pause for Thought script.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Alex and Rabbi Jonathan back onto the screen now too. We've had a few questions. Emma, I'm going to ask you a question first, if that's okay. Emma, who's our great technology expert.
Sitting on the spot a little bit. So thank you, firstly. All of your talks were very different and provided like really interesting insights into your time with the BBC. So yeah, some of the anecdotes that you brought up reminded me of, I was driving a couple of weeks ago and I'm not as highbrow as Jonathan, so I was listening to Radio 1 and the DJs were very pointedly saying that they had done a radio edit of a song because there's a pop song that's just come out where the lyrics say, "I heard Jesus lost his mind on a night out." And it's imagining Jesus basically on drugs, and they'd had to change the lyrics after complaints. And I was really surprised because I just didn't think of the BBC as an organisation that had to be sensitive to kind of Christian sensibilities. It just really didn't occur to me. So I was just wondering from each of you whether you have kind of felt like you have had to think about Christian sensibilities or just being sensitive in general. And also like whether you find the people that you're working with, the producers, are more leaning towards Christian sensibilities or just non-religious sensibilities.
I mean, first of all, I find that absolutely bizarre. Like I
don't. Now, every time they play the song, it now says, "I heard my mate lost his mind on a night."
I think that's absolutely bizarre, and I am quite shocked. I don't think the BBC should have to do anything of the sort. Get somebody to change the lyrics of their song. I think that's absolutely bizarre. Anyway.
At school, we did Othello for A-level. And apparently at one school, they couldn't say she played the strumpet in my bed. So they changed it to she played the trumpet in my bed. Someone said, might have been worse.
Dougal told you that's even worse.
I did want to point, I mean, this ties in with Emma's point. First of all, Emma, I'm going to go and check that out because I just think that's really weird. And I think it's a religious illiteracy thing. It's what I was saying to you at the beginning. So both Pete and Jonathan gave an example of when a presenter had asked them a question like out of the blue. And to me, for a Radio 4 presenter to ask Jonathan about Jeremy Corbyn without telling him is like, I'm shocked by that as well. Like, I personally would never, ever do that to a guest who was going onto the radio for me, because there are sensibilities attached to that question that the BBC should be aware of. And I think the same goes for Pete's question about, why, it's anyway. So I think that what you're experiencing there is a sort of degree of like assuming that people think things or assuming that people know things when they actually don't. So yeah, that would be my answer to that. Is like, to me, it demonstrates that people don't understand religion.
But I mean, what you're saying about you were surprised that BBC censored. I mean, I remember back in probably before you were born, Alex. Certainly before you were born, Emma, there was the track by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and Mike Reed, who was the Radio 1 DJ of the day, just was led a campaign to have the record banned because he didn't like the double meanings that were littered throughout it, and he succeeded. Okay, that was at 1980s, right enough.
No, it does have a history of censorship. I know that. It's just. Yeah.
Well, another one. I was on my way into. So I was on my way into radio to do local radio in 3 counties, but I was listening to Alex Jones doing his Sunday morning show, and he played the James Blunt song, and there were various versions of this particular song, beautiful, and what the original had a rather strong word in it, and it was replaced in various editions to make it palatable. And as Alan's playing it on Radio 2 at about 6:45 in the morning, as I'm on my way up the M1. I'm thinking, I wonder which version of it which censored version of it he'll play. And he played the original. And it was like all hell broke loose. And I just texted him. I said, really? He said, what? And he said, oh. And then the next thing he's apologizing for people who might have heard a swear word on the radio. And then the producer got absolutely slated for it. She was a good friend of mine, still is. She got absolutely slammed for having chosen the wrong version of that song. So wasn't to do with Jesus, but it was a bit rude. And there's, and yeah, there are still sensitivities out there that we have to be, that the producers have to be aware of, and presenters too, right enough.
I don't think it's just about radio either. I'm very conscious giving a sermon or speaking. There'll almost always be non-Jewish people in the synagogue. I don't want to say things which leave people feeling hurt by what I said because I didn't care about how they would perceive it. And there's a huge diversity within faiths as well as across faiths. And I think it's quite an important. There's that balance between humor and sensitivity is difficult, but I think it's quite important to think one doesn't want to leave people feeling hurt.
But isn't there a danger, though, that one can become very bland in what you say?
I just try to offend everyone. It covers all the bases.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to ask you, Emma, to get back to your other job now. Can you spotlight Judy? Judy Herman, I think, has a question.
Yeah, I've unmuted. This is a question for Rabbi Wittenberg. I really like the pause and the change of pace that is thought for the day. I don't know if I sometimes think we get a Jewish speaker when there's a reason, for example, a festival, whereas other faiths seem to get more turns without them being pegged to a particular moment for that faith. Now, am I paranoid? Am I getting that wrong? Or is that any chance that I might have a point? And also, Rabbi Wittenberg, as a fellow dog lover, I love your book, Things My Dog Has Taught Me.
The dog has just responded to that by growling in the corner.
Right, well, mine's at my feet.
But I really don't know. I mean, I find them completely random. One of the things I don't understand is you generally get from thought for the day, you don't hear from them and don't hear from them, and then suddenly you get 2 dates a week apart. So I don't think it's focused on festivals. In fact, 2 years running now, I've had Yom Ha'atzmaut, and they've not known that it was Yom Ha'atzmaut. And I've had to ring the producer and say, actually, maybe you think this is wrong, but can I change that date? Because the second I mention Israel, there'll be a torrent of stuff. And if I don't mention Israel, I feel I'm betraying my own people. So I don't, I think it's random. And sometimes I think possibly a little bit too random. I imagine the chief rabbi gets something around the high holidays and a Holocaust Memorial Day, but beyond that, I doubt it.
Well, it's because we have so many festivals anyway. There's always one near enough.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes, Judy, if you don't mind me sort of jumping in, I think what we find as producers at the BBC is that, sometimes it has to be a conscious decision to make sure that we are portraying that diversity of faiths. And, if it means talking about a festival, I think that's probably a justifiable way of making sure, better to have. I get a bit annoyed with, like, we keep doing festivals, but it's a viable way to get a good story from a community on, So yeah, sometimes it's a bit contrived. But that's why we need the communities to come to us with the other stories that are not just about the festivals, because we don't know what's happening in a community. We rely on you guys to tell us.
Judy, I think.
Well, just to say, we are supposed to be very opinionated, we Jews, so I'm guessing we wouldn't be short of an opinion. None of you would be if you were asked to do something. I just, maybe, as I said, I might be being paranoid, but I often think, I haven't heard from a Jew except on this sort of subject for ages, and other people seem to be speaking more generally, so it worries me slightly.
If I can sort of jump in on your comment there, David Baddiel's program recently about Jews don't count. I'd be really interested to know whether any of you sense that perhaps Jews are treated differently in the BBC, or to other faiths, or not.
No, certainly my experience was that there were a whole range of guest presenters from different faiths coming in to do the Pause for Thought on Radio 2 particularly. And there was no, it was a very convivial, and they used to meet together as groups at special drink sessions and farewell to Terry sessions and all the rest of it. And there was no tokenism about it, or there didn't seem to be. There was just a bunch of nice people, basically.
Yeah, and Jonathan did a whole came and did the local radio lives, 20 lives on a Sunday morning about the environment twice now.
Yeah, I loved it.
And we had people from different faith groups doing that, but it was really nice to have a Jewish voice. I mean, for me, that was quite refreshing to have a Jewish voice talking about those issues around the environment and the climate.
Can you explain how the sort of, the radio live works? Because I'm not sure whether people quite
it's just because well, it's going to change, but because there are so many local radio stations, we get a guest who will come in and talk about whatever issue it is between 6:30 and 9 on a Sunday morning, and we divide that time up into 8-minute interview slots, and they do about 18 interviews one after the other with different local radio stations. And I'm always so grateful to the guests who are willing to do that, because it's a marathon, but you do reach a very big audience, by doing it. So
that kind of came to the fore. I mean, I did one of those way back in the early days of my Radio 2 stuff, but that kind of came to the fore when Liz Truss was doing the rounds a few weeks back, and how she got grilled by several different local radio presenters in a way that I just thought was brilliant, and it just kind of showed that each particular local radio station had its personality and its particular set of interests, shall we say. And yeah, I remember that. But when you come on as a faith presenter in that context, you're really just saying the same thing over and over and over again, because they're just.
Yes, I mean, you feel like you're repeating yourself. But
But
I thought it was amazing. You get this timetable saying at 7:29 and 30 seconds you'll be, and it sticks to time. It gets to the right station. It's amazing.
Sheffield, Leeds, anywhere around the country, you're sort of all over the country at 5-minute intervals or whatever it might be. It's brilliant. That was all your fault. Now the way you're all right.
Anyway, I'm afraid we're coming to the end of the program. Thank you so much, the three of you, for giving such really revealing insights into the way religious programming is made, the way it works, and something of the impact I know that you all hope to have through your broadcasts. I'm going to hand over to Emma Brand, who is going to conclude the program and let us know about next week.
Hi, so I'm Emma and I work for both the Lyons Learning Project and Jewish Renaissance. So thank you on behalf of us and also Insiders Outsiders for being here today and for sharing your insights, and to everyone who joined us on Zoom and to everyone who watches the recording. So next week we finish our series with Mark Damaza, who was Newsnight editor and head of political programmes, director of BBC News and controller of BBC4. So he had BBC Radio 4. So he had a 30-year career at the BBC. So he'll be reflecting on his time at the BBC and offering his thoughts on its past, present and future. So join us next week as we close the series. And I'm just going to put a few links in the chat in case you want more information about any of the organisations involved and the next session as well. So yes, thank you very much to all our speakers, and yeah, have a good night.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, please, Rabbi Pete, Rabbi Jonathan, Alex, for your contribution tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.